A fair number of people filtering in here.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and thank you for joining us today to talk about the book on the rocket ship. I'm Bruno Mano. I'm a trustee emeritus here at the Fordham Institute, and I'm also at present a special senior advisor with the Walton Family Foundation in their K-12 program area. Let me introduce here briefly and quickly Richard Whitmire, who's a veteran newspaper reporter and former editorial writer at USA Today. He's with us today to discuss his book. We'll begin with a short question and answer period between the two of us. That'll take about 15 or so minutes. And then we'll break for 3 minutes as the panel gets assembled up here, and then continue the conversation for maybe another 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll have about another 20 to 30 minutes for open question and answer. Those here in the audience and those watching online can follow along and add commentary on Twitter if they'd like with the hashtag #OnTheRocketShip. So I'll repeat that again. The hashtag is #OnTheRocketShip. We'll also take questions from the live audience and the Twitter audience, so you can send those in and they'll pass them along at various points along the way. And I think I've covered all the logistics for the event. So without further ado, let's begin. And let me ask Richard the first question here, which is the obvious question, I think. How did you get hooked on this topic, or how did you get interested in it?
It's a great question, and it goes back to a previous book that I wrote about Michelle Rhee here in Washington called The Bee Eater. And I ended up following Michelle through a year, and it turned out to be her last year. And the idea, and the reason I really wanted to do that book, was that I considered Washington to be sort of a last best chance at turning around, a really troubled urban district. If Rhee couldn't do it here in Washington with everything that she had at her disposal, then what hope did St. Louis or Kansas City or Detroit have? And of course, at the end of my reporting, everything kind of looked like it was heading south. Fenty lost, and Rhee got pushed out. And at the time, of course, I had no idea and would never have guessed that the next mayor would end up keeping those reforms. I thought it was all over. So I sort of threw up my hands, and I go, now's the time to do this book on high-performing charters that I've always wanted to do, because I saw them in action during the book I did on boys. And I was just amazed at these schools, the kind of culture they had and the kind of urgency that the teachers had. And I know that there's a full range of charter schools, some bad and some great, but I thought, well, what if I just did those high performers, the top 15, 20%, those who are getting at least a year and a half of learning out of every year of school? Can they expand a lot faster than they have been? Is there potential there? So that's why I launched on this book.
I'm going to literally go to about the first page of the book. It is the first page, and then also page 305, and ask you the next question. So it's kind of the bookends of the book. I actually read it cover to cover. And in my mind, there are a couple of names that you mention here and phrases that you use, which I think are an interesting way of thinking about the book, literally. The beginning and the end of the book is a way of sort of framing the conversation. On page 1, you talk about the Fibonacci sequence. And then at the end of the book, on page 305, you talk about the Pareto principle. So could you maybe talk a little bit about those, explain what they mean as a way of sort of framing the book?
Sure.
And if you disagree with me, say that's the wrong way to frame it. But
no, that's fine. What was interesting about Rocketship, I looked around for a small charter CMO that was incredibly ambitious. And I'd never even heard of Rocketship at the time. And people kept saying, you should go see Rocketship out in San Jose. So I did. And what I found so fascinating about Rocketship is just the story itself, because one of the co-founders, John Danner, is just an unlikely co-founder. He's a Stanford electrical engineer, an internet entrepreneur, and he built one of the very first online advertising companies. and cashed in his many, many millions and decided that education would be his next startup. And so when I met him, and John's got that sort of, you know, entrepreneurial, little bit of arrogance, since he isn't here, I'll use that word. I mean, he's just, you know, he's done it, and he has done it. And so when I first met him, he was trying to explain the principle of rocket ship growth. And, you know, you go to a new city, and then you open 8 in each city, and then another city, and you open another 8. And he said it's like the Fibonacci sequence in math, that you start, you know, just add up, start with little small digits, and then add, you know, to the previous one, and pretty soon you're up to huge numbers. It's just a little trick that math teachers do to keep their students interested. But he was using the Fibonacci sequence to say this is how Rocketship is going to fly. And we are going to do this on our own. We are going to close the achievement gap on our own. So, I mean, this was quite a bit of bravado on his part. So I go, yes, you're the guy. I want to see how fast can you really expand, what happens when you push the, you know, the pedal to the metal. And then the Pareto principle is just that, you know, you look around in any organization and you find the small thing that's going to drive the larger thing. You look for the 20% that then the 80% would follow. And that plays out, and it's very much that's another really Silicon Valley sort of concept. Everyone uses that there and embraces it. And so John and Preston, who is here, did a lot of things differently with Rocketship. And a lot of them are rooted in that startup mentality. And so, for example, a big example with this one would be that you would ask John or Preston, why are you only doing K through 5 schools? You know, where are these kids going to go? What's the point? You know, if they just go into traditional middle schools, then the gains will wash out. And the answer would go back, well, that's the 20% that drives the 80%. He said, and then talking about just San Jose area, he says, if I flood San Jose with, quote, overeducated poor Latino kids, the system will have to respond. And it's easy to say, oh, no, it won't. But I'll have to admit that he turned out to be at least partially correct, because what happened was maybe the traditional district schools didn't respond that much, but Rocketship, really their biggest innovation is sort of radicalizing parents. And they did that quite well, and these parents went out and said, we're going to find the schools for our kids to go to. And so they went out and pulled in a charter school called Alpha, which now has opened up its second, and KIPP is expanding. So Danner's, the principle actually did play out in that, in that way.
You've mentioned every good story has protagonists, antagonists. You've mentioned the two principal protagonists. Preston is here with us, and so we'll be up in a minute. And John, how would you think about the sort of antagonist here in the story? What is it that pushes back against this vision of the protagonist?
Well, there would be two, internal and external, really. You know, Rocketship ended up having a tough year, all of which is laid out. A lot of small groups like this that expand quickly, you know, sort of hit a wall in one way or another. Achievement First did, Aspire did, and Rocketship did as well. And I think it was part of that, you know, the radical Danner, we're going to make this change, and, you know, so quickly that it went past its own capacity there. And now they've sort of reorganized and recovered, and they're back to their, you know, their sort of normal trajectory of hitting home runs. But they tripped up internally, in part because of that. And I mean, Rocketship's such a fascinating story. They kind of flew under the radar in Santa Clara County. Santa Clara County is like, it's huge. It's like half of Silicon Valley. And there are 31 school districts. And these 31 school districts, of course, they would just routinely reject Rocketship's, you know, proposal to come in. But there's this county board, you know, that really until now didn't do much of anything. I mean, they wouldn't describe it that way, but they had, you know, some special ed oversight, but they didn't actually have students, a real district, but they had chartering authority. So Rocketship would just go and say, hey, you know, we're appealing to you. Well, they found some very sympathetic board members there, including one in particular who was just determined to to right what he saw as wrongs that had been done with low-income Latino kids there. And he saw Rocketship as the vehicle. And they're just approving one Rocketship school after another. And at one point, they gave them 20. I mean, when does this happen? And the school districts, I think, at first they said, oh, whatever, you know what I mean? Rocketship can't possibly open all these schools. We're not threatened by this. But gradually, it began to dawn on them that, wow, this actually is a threat. We don't want Rocketship coming into our school district. We have to do something about it. And they've figured out how to stop Rocketship. Not completely, but I think Rocketship is opening only one new school next year. And they had to go through the appeal process, one new school in Santa Clara County. And they had to go through the appeals process, which they just won, to do that. So that was the external antagonist.
And you also, in the book, talk about their expansion beyond where they started into Milwaukee and other places and some of the problems that they encountered there. So maybe talk about those two to get the full story out here on the trouble they ran into along the way when it came to expansion and scaling up.
Well, I mean, people sort of figured out the threat that Rocketship presented. So when you go into a Milwaukee, the unions had this figured out, and the school board and the teachers had this figured out as well. So it was very interesting for me to be there on the ground as they would recruit students, because I would follow the principal and others from Rocketship around as we'd go to various schools and hand out pamphlets, and there was really active resistance, and it made their recruiting difficult. And there are several reasons, and they ended up opening up short, more than 100 students short, and partly because of the resistance there. So it's not going to be, now they're coming into DC as well, 2015. They're going to be in Ward 8. And it's a pretty inventive way they're doing with that, because they're teaming up with Jack McCarthy and Appletree Early Learning. So you'll have the pre-K with then feeding into the K-5 Rocketship. So this is something, frankly, that other schools should have done years ago with Appletree, but in this case, they got teamed up. So it'll be really interesting here in DC.
Talk a little bit about the model itself, the Rocketship model, so that everyone has some basic sense of what it is they do that is somewhat unique. And then maybe bleed that over into some of the problems that they began to have with the model per se, and how they began to rejigger things. So lay that story out a little bit.
Well, I mentioned I took John Danner's story as far as cashing in as many millions and going into education. He went to Nashville to do his teaching, and he was teaching in a low-income school there. And he was struggling, like a lot of teachers were, and he finally figured out that the only way he could reach his kids was through personalized learning, and he had to meet them, each one, where they were, and then take them from there. And this was his big light bulb. So he thought, when I design my charter schools, this is going to be it, personalized learning. And that's held true Rocketship through today. And of course, Danner being a software guy, immediately he wanted to do blended learning, online learning that would personalize for each student. And so when Preston and John started putting everything together, they went out looking for this software, thinking it must be out there somewhere. I mean, there are all these software writers, all these smart people, and they couldn't find anything. There was nothing out there, because there was so much money to be made by the textbook publishers who just put their stuff online. And it wasn't really adaptive learning. It didn't track where the kid was and where the deficits the kid has, and then circle back and figure out how to reteach that. And so one day they discovered Dreambox, and thought, wow, this is the first adaptive learning platform that we've seen. And so Danner calls up his friends, Reed Hastings from Netflix, and says, hey, Reed, you got to come over and see this. And so Reed comes over and he sees this and he goes, wow, this is pretty cool. And Reed happened to know the guy who was the chief software engineer there with Dreambox, and he calls him up and he goes, hey, nice job. And he goes, hey, Reed, nice to hear from you. By the way, we're about to go out of business. So they had great software, but not such a great business model. And so Reed Hastings bought the company. And then turned it over to the Charter School Growth Fund, and then Rocketship started working with Dreambox to improve, what they're doing, but that's the best example of personalized learning. And Rocketship, of course, is way ahead of everybody else on how to do that personalized learning. So it's not just plunking a kid down in front of a computer. So they've been very choosy about their software, and then very thoughtful about whether it should be a lab versus in the classroom and under control of the teacher and that. So that's.
And then maybe talk a little bit more, and this is maybe a bit too much into the weeds, but I think it's interesting myself. The sort of efficiencies that were built into the model and how they began to feed the efficiencies, that literally the dollars that they had saved and reconfiguring some of the teachers and so on and so forth. Talk a little bit more about that and lay that issue out.
Well, I mean...
And talk a bit about teachers' role in this.
Well, it's really all together in one. And start with TFA. I mean, and this is the Pareto principle. Don't do anything yourself that somebody else is going to do better. So John looked at how to hire teachers and train them, and he thought, TFA does a much better job than we will ever do. So they made TFA their de facto personnel department. So you would have 2 first-years TFAs in there, and then more veteran TFAers. But most of those schools in the early days were mostly TFA. And then he said, well, how are we going to hang on to these TFA teachers longer? And he thought, well, we're going to pay them a lot more. And we're going to promote them faster. And they're going to be promoted quickly, sort of like you would in Silicon Valley. And this is more startup mentality. And they will stay longer, and we're going to be able to pay them more because we're going to have fewer teachers in the school. And we're going to have fewer teachers because we're using these labs for online learning. So it all melded together. And it is an interesting model, and they keep tweaking it. They're now looking, and Preston can talk about this a little more for people who want to know about online learning. They're now shifting. They want to make sure they have software that's so-called assignable. So it's not sufficient to just go off and take you where Dreambox or ST Math wants to go. A particular teacher with a particular kid wants this particular thing. Challenge worked on at that moment, so it's assignable. You can assign that, and Rocketship's way ahead of everybody else on figuring out how to use this stuff.
Maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll break, reassemble with the panel, and continue the conversation. You also talk about other high-performing charter management organizations that are in this space who have obviously very different models. But how would you begin to sort of pull this together a bit in talking about them as a whole?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I realized in the first setup I never got to the central question of the book, which is, can high-performing charters, do things that they aren't doing now, beyond just adding 1 grade a year? And certainly John Danner's dream of the Fibonacci sequence with Rocketship is not turning out. I mean, they're continuing to grow, and they're one of the fastest growers, and they're doing well. But they obviously, Preston will be the first to tell you they can't do it on their own. But I found other ways that they really can reach more students. And so I went to Memphis and profiled the Achievement School District there, where they're taking over the lowest 5%. They would object to the word taking over. They would say, we're seeking partners for our schools. But they're taking over the schools. And for example, they're convincing schools like high-performing charters like Aspire to come in and take over an entire school in one, all the kids. It's just, essentially a restart. And that's something that charters have been hesitant to do. Mm-hmm. But in Memphis, the thing is, hey, if you'll do this, we'll give you an entire school building. So that's pretty appealing. And then my favorite one, frankly, I found in Spring Branch, Texas, mm-hmm. school district in Houston. And I went into this book thinking compacts, and I don't know how many of you even know what a compact is. I barely knew. But it's where you strike a deal with the district, and so the district is bringing you into your schools, you as a charter in some way. And so I visited Denver and Spring Branch. But in Spring Branch, I just walked away, my jaw dropped. I go, this is replicable. And you just have a superintendent there, sort of a Joe Average superintendent, Duncan Klusman, who just one day got curious about, well, what are they doing at Yes Prep over there, the other side of town? You know, so he went in and he saw a Yes Prep school and goes, wow, that's pretty cool. And then he went in and saw a KIPP school, and he had the same reaction. He goes, you know, there are two things that I need out of those schools. You know, I need the sense of urgency that the teachers have, and I need the sense of that culture that I see in these schools. And he said, well, how am I going to do that? I don't want to just, you know, invite in these charter schools to be independent operators. So what he did is he took two middle schools, you know, that were fairly low performing, low income, et cetera, and he stuck KIPP in one, Yes Prep in the other. So they had half the building. But this is not like a New York City co-location. The principals are like this, and the district principals would go through KIPP leadership training. They would have common professional development. All the kids would share electives, and then he hired a KIPP person to come in and be head of transformation. I mean, and then they reset and greatly upgraded the goals for the entire district. I mean, this guy, he's revolutionized this district using KIPP and Yes Prep as sort of the key, you know, fulcrum there. And he did it without any of the yelling and screaming and fighting that you see in these other schools. And it's an average sort of school district, 35,000 students with the usual mix of rich, poor, et cetera. There are hundreds of school districts like this around the country that could do what Spring Branch is doing. So that gave me a lot of hope. And in the end, I conclude that, yes, there are vehicles for greatly expanding the reach of these high-performing charters.
Good. I've tried, we've reached about 20 minutes, a little over 20 minutes. I've tried to lay out the story as much as possible. Is there anything else you want to add that we might have missed before we break and reassemble to kind of complete an overview of the story?
I think we've done the overview, and I want to hear from Preston and Chantel. So, because they'll really tell you what's possible here, as well as Scott.
We'll take a 2 or 3 minute break, reassemble here as the panel. And we'll see you in a few minutes.
Thanks.
Okay.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, we're ready to go. Let's Reassemble, thanks. Let me quickly introduce members of the panel. You have extensive descriptions in the material that you received or that was sent to you, so I'm not going to give you a paragraph on each. I'll just give you the headline. I'll start with my right, your left. Scott Pearson, who is Executive Director of the DC Public Charter School Board, which is the authorizing entity here in DC. Chantel Wright, who is the founder and CEO of Achievement Prep, a DC charter school network. And then one of the protagonists we're lucky to have with us today, Preston Smith, who's the co-founder and CEO of Rocketship Education. So let's pick up the story and circle back to some of the themes. Just in your honor, Preston, we'll start with you. Who's at the heart of the story in many respects. Let me ask you maybe a question not directly related to the book, but as you've looked back on the story that's written here, what would you say is a kind of key takeaway from based on your own experience and reading the book of this story about Rocketship? And let's, for the moment, focus on the question of scale. We'll come back to some other issues, but say the question of scale.
Yeah, so I would say one takeaway is this work is really hard. This is very serious work, which if you're in the work, you know just the rigor and the demands and everything from special education to kids, parents, families, teachers, talent, curriculum, instruction. But that said, I do think part of the story too is that scale is possible. Maybe not the Fibonacci sequence, but you know, we're going to be in 3 new regions in 3 years, and we're fastest growing charter network in the country, going to be at 6,000 kids next year in our 8th year. We started at 160 kids. So, I mean, scale is possible, and I think if you're really disciplined and focused in your approach, and especially really developed talent, you can do it.
Well, why don't we go to Chantel here? So this question of scale, from your perspective, as someone who is sort of in the trenches, day in and day out, who started with one school, who has now done some additional, how do you think about this scale from your this issue of scale from your perspective? Is it possible, or what aspect of it has proven to be maybe the most difficult, if not impossible, but very difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say, obviously it's possible because Rocketship exists. We are not a network that believes in the, Fibonacci approach by any means. I admire that and think that that's great if that's what's happening. I think the hardest part about growth has to do with leadership and talent, quite honestly, right? For us, when we think about it, we think about, we don't want to just grow for the sake of opening schools and meeting numbers. We want to make sure that we're doing it with quality and that we're actually making an impact. And I think a lot of times the hardest piece is that talent, the leadership talent, as well as teacher talent, and maintaining that across the CMOs. I think it's also important that you are very aware of the community in which you serve and not just thinking about the model that you have, but does that model actually work within the community? Mm-hmm. And so I would say those are the biggest factors that we think about when we think about growth. We also take the approach, instead of kind of thinking about numbers, we think about it more from how can we work with the existing sectors? How can we work within the movement? So Achievement Prep last year was one of the first schools in DC to do a restart, and we took over a low-performing school. And our thought there was, at the end of the day, if schools don't make it, it's not because of the children. It's really because of what the adults in the building are doing, and children shouldn't suffer. So we took the chance as one of the high-performing schools in the area and took over a low-performing school, and glad that we did it. So I think we personally think about growth. Are there ways that we can continue to work within the sector? Are there ways that we can work with DC public schools, other schools, et cetera, to serve children that way and expand our impact? Okay, I'm going to go to Scott next, but I'm going to come back to you after that. So I'll give you a forewarning here. I'm going to give you an opportunity to maybe, after this first brief question and answer, to ask a question to one of these folks about this issue that we've just been talking about. But let's go to Scott first. You're in the authorizing seat, and you deal with these issues in a very specific way. The charter board here has thought a lot about this issue of scale and replication,
and sort of, I might get the words wrong, but a fast track approach to authorizing. Talk a little bit about the issues and the trade-offs here that you make. Maybe reflect a little bit on some of the comments Chantel made about the recent takeover is the wrong word, restart that you were involved in with them. Give folks some sense of how this begins to play out as an authorizer.
Sure. So in DC, roughly 44% of the children go to charter schools. So nearly half of the city is charter schools, and our mission at the charter board is to grow the number of quality schools and offer a wide variety of choice to schools. And so one of the things we've done is be very deliberate about only chartering schools that we think are going to be high quality, but also going to our highest quality schools like Chantel and encouraging them to grow. And what we hear from many of them is exactly what Chantel said. It's all about the talent, and schools who don't feel that they have the person identified who can open their second campus or their third campus are often reluctant to grow, and they'll say, give us a couple of years, let us cultivate that person. And so it's often very slow, deliberate work. And when we've seen schools that have grown without that kind of planning, for example, a school will be awarded a building that requires them to add 300 or 400 students to their enrollment to be able to fill the building and pay the rent, that doesn't go well. And then we see a few schools, I would say in DC, KIPP is the best example, who are extremely deliberate about their human capital pipeline so that they are, from having teaching residencies to having extra slots for assistant principals so that they can be cultivating people and getting them ready to lead schools, are able to consistently produce this talent that allows them to grow. But outside of DC, there are organizations like Rocketship. And so DC is extremely fortunate to have a large number of what I would call homegrown, high-quality school leaders like Chantel. But in our quest to bring the highest quality schools to our students, we thought, well, let's not only limit ourselves to the talent we have in DC, let's look around the country and bring the very best schools that we can. And so when we found a school like Rocketship who had the track record and also, I guess I'd call it the DNA for growth, it was a school that we really encouraged to come and apply to DC.
Richard, let me just turn to you. You've heard some comments now about this issue, the issue of scale and leadership and so on from a number of different perspectives. What crosses your mind as you listen to this conversation? Is there a specific sort of issue you want to raise or frame one of these issues in a different way?
Well, it seems kind of arrogant on my part as a mere writer to be in the presence of operators, real people here, and say, you're too conservative in your growth. But I'm going to make the argument anyway. And I would point, I think we're kind of at a special moment in time here. And I'll use an example, the Edmund Brooke Charter Schools in Boston. Mm-hmm. Now, what you start with here is you've got TFA, thousands of TFAers who have been out there and have teaching experience and they've got leadership experience. You've got an incredible base here. It's almost like a family. And so let's take the founder of Brooke as an example, John Clark. He did his TFA work in New Orleans, and then he came back to Massachusetts to start a school, and he taught at Boston Collegiate, which is one of the top charters. And then when he was designing his own school, he drew on Roxbury Prep, which is one of the oldest and most accomplished schools. And then when he wanted to find the best writing program in the country, he went to Achievement First, which gladly let him in and said, here's what we do with writing. And when he wanted to find the best back office operation in the country, he went to Noble in Chicago, and they gladly let him in. So you've got this incredible infrastructure there, that has talent and how-to, and they're sharing because they've all got the same family background with TFA. So I would make the argument that, that Chantel should be reaching more kids in the 8th Ward than she is. That you have the capability to do that. And that is your mission. I mean, you said you didn't want to expand for the sake of expansion, but you see the kind of education the kids in the 7th and 8th Wards have been getting for years. Why not? what's really keeping you from expanding faster?
So, well, again, I think it's not just about, for us, it really is making sure that when we open up, we can do so, and we can do so well. I think that while all of those resources, things that you talked about are actually there and they are viable, what's important and what we found, particularly when you think about those children that we serve in Ward 8, school culture is key. And that's not something that you can just create in masses. At least I have not figured that out. Maybe Preston has. Come to Ward 8, I'd love to see the results of that. But, you know, I think that that's key and it's very important. And school culture is something that also takes time to develop. And for me, I think when you think about those children, that's even more critical. And you do think about where they are in school. It's even more critical that when you open up, you get it right. And I think that sometimes we tend to experiment on children and we tend to say, oh, I'll figure it out, or we'll figure it out as we go, and children's lives are at stake. And so I absolutely feel the burden of growth, if you will, and that's something that we've talked about as a board. But I think the burden to make sure that we do it right and that we are in a place where we feel like when we open those doors, we can do so with quality from day one and not quality day 120 or 220. Then I think we will grow faster and we'll grow and more of an impact, but we're not there yet. And so until we're there, I'm actually okay making sure that the 620 that I serve to the absolute best of our ability.
Preston, why don't you get in here? Because my sense is, at least based on the reading of the book, and I've known you for a while and know some of your aches and pains and all that, you have a different perspective on that issue, I think. So lay it out. Particularly, you might want to talk about the Come to Jesus meeting that at one point, that in the book, you're pushing in one direction for change and growth, and you got a lot of pushback from the staff about this, and you had to go to John and have a little Come to Jesus meeting with him. So talk about this issue that Chantel laid out there from your perspective.
Yeah, and at Rocketship, so quality is number one, right? We have great schools. When we open a school, we expect it to be great. But I think mindset matters, right? The achievement gap is something that is pervasive. It's hundreds of thousands, millions, it's tons of kids. And if we continue to grow at too slow of a pace or have impact at too slow of a pace, I mean, we're not talking about a few years, we're talking about generations of kids. And just so, I mean, it's in the book, but I am one of those kids. Like, I attended underperforming schools. I got the note from UCLA and got the call from the dean that, hey, we take athletes, not scholars from your school, right? Like, that's real. That's on the phone. Somebody said that. That's not made up. That's 92376, my zip code that I grew up in, and that's a label, and you carry it. And so I think I'm really passionate about, we got a problem, and we need to go after it. And not that Rocketship's going to do it alone, but we can all do it. And I think mindset matters. So we've always approached the work with, we will scale, we will grow, we will open schools that serve 500 kids right out the bat, and they will be quality from day one. And I think when you approach the work in that manner, you think about things differently. You say, okay, if we're going to do that, what the heck are we going to do about the pipeline now? How are we developing teachers now? How are we going to specialize their craft so that they can get even more effective more quickly? How are we going to partner with parents? And so I think mindset matters so much. And if you're too many organizations that are in the mindset of like, we'll grow when we're ready, rather than we're ready to grow, right? And how do we make sure we're always ready to grow? And I think if you approach from that, and quality, you can hold quality on both, but you've got to have that mindset of like, we will grow. I guess is a pervasive problem. We will get rid of it in our lifetime, come hell or high water, and how the hell are we going to make that happen? And I think when you do that, stuff happens.
And if I can add on, I think while, yes, mindset matters, I think resources also matter, right? So you talked about Dan opening up this school with millions of dollars, right? We opened up on per pupil. So, and that's not millions of dollars. And so I think that there is, while the mindset definitely matters, there's also resources and certain things that you have to have behind you in order to make that happen. I happen to know the draw and the promises that were made to an organization like Rocketship to come to DC and what that means and what we'll give and what we'll do. And that doesn't happen for every CMO and every growth. Achievement Prep is in its 6th year, one of the highest performing schools in the city, and we still don't have a permanent home. How do you explain that, right? So, but yet you have other CMOs being promised this and that, and we'll do this and we'll make that happen, and funds going behind that. And we appreciate the growth and the support that we get from the funders who do support our growth. But I think it's not just about, I can want it all day and be up there the best cheerleader ever, but if I also don't have the resources to develop, for example, a talent pipeline internally, right? I don't have KIPS Foundation, so I can't create my own teacher pipeline, my own principal and residence pipeline. Those things matter. And so regardless of my mindset, it's also about the resources that are given to this. And so my push would be, when we talk about scale, that we also think about how we're supporting these schools to do this. And it's not enough to just say, kind of follow this model or that model, and what, you know, Noble and Achievement First, all schools that we visit and we admire and learn from, et cetera. But there's also a certain amount of resources that go to those schools. It's also a certain amount of promises that come with that name in those schools that don't happen, particularly in a perfect example of a school like mine. So
I have a question on the cat.
Yeah, sure.
I love you, Chantel. I love the
you
work
too,
you
Preston.
do.
Let's go.
Coming from California, it is tough to hear DC talk about that, not enough resources.
That's the point I was going to make.
I was just going to, I mean, we do it on per pupil too. And I guess I'd say, I think there was a beauty. I mean, this was really, I think, the genius of John Danner. He really made us live within our resources. And on that per pupil, I mean, every one of our campuses are going to be in a permanent facility next year, every single one. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal. We don't have to spend effort year after year negotiating with districts, and we've done that with the per pupil. So I'd like, it's possible. Like,
but somewhere along there, you also have a network office, right? That I'm sure is funded in some way outside of that per pupil that helps to make all of those things happen, right? And so it's not like you even just said it to me back there. You're not in the schools day to day. I'm in the school day to day, right? So there's also a network, and there's a foundation of formation, not necessarily foundation in the funding sense, but there is something behind the actual schools that make it happen. And so there's a lot of the work that doesn't have to happen in the school because your network office takes care of it. And you go and you send the team out to Milwaukee first or Washington first and spend and do all of that time. So somebody somewhere is coming. That's not all per pupil.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, you know, dollars and cents, we could add them up, and I bet you with your 620.
And I bet you have more.
Well, with 6,000 kids, we definitely do, versus 620. But I just say, I think it's mindset, right? Again, like, what do you do with that per pupil? How do you allocate it to things that are crucial, not just to the sustainability of school, but to growth, right? And if you do that, it's possible. It's totally possible.
You have to, Scott, you have to deal with issues like this. It's not just a question of inviting people in and saying, figure this out. How do you begin to talk with folks who you would like to invite in about some of these resource issues, about facilities, about back office services, et cetera, et cetera? Is it up to them to figure this out? Do you have a role in helping them think this issue about resources through, or the complexities of scale and what's involved in that?
Well, we do. We don't, the charter board doesn't control all the resources. We don't have any facilities. We don't control the per pupil. What we try to do, first of all, is with our tier 1 schools, like Chantel, is we try to say to them, first of all, you will have a fast track to growth if you want to grow. It's not going to be a hard thing to do. Then we've worked with the people who have the buildings, which is DC Public Schools and the Deputy Mayor for Education, to say, you should prioritize our highest quality schools when you're giving out these buildings, because in the past it wasn't always like that. It was who had political connections, who got in first. So we've done that. And then when we talk with people outside the city, we really try to emphasize DC has among the highest reimbursements in the country for pupil reimbursements. We have among the highest reimbursements for serving students with disabilities in the country. We have a kind of an archaic, difficult facilities process to manage through. But if you look at the results, 40% of the charter schools in DC are housed in a building a public school building that used to be a DCPS building. So we try to emphasize what's attractive about DC and let people know, you know, for some reason DC had this reputation as not being friendly to outsiders, you know, and all the love was going to New Orleans and Tennessee. We said, you know, it's crazy that you shouldn't be looking at DC as well. Our reimbursements are way higher. We actually have a better facilities environment, a better reform environment. So that's how we've been successful. But it breaks my heart that Chantel doesn't have a permanent facility. And if I had a building to give out, she would be the first one I would give it to.
Richard, did you want to?
Well, yeah, just to follow up, I mean, if you had a little magic wand or whatever to wave, you know, where you could really quickly ramp up your top performers, and you've done a great job of that over the years. You had a lot of bad stuff to get rid of, and you have encouraged the top performers, but it's a slow process. What would make it really fast so that you could reach more kids with achievement prep kind of schools?
Well, there are still 25 school buildings in this city that are sitting empty and unused and that have not been allocated to schools. So the first thing I would do is get those buildings out and make sure that any tier 1 school could have immediate access to those buildings. I would ensure that DC has extra money that they give out to charter schools. I would make sure that they were supporting school growth more than they even are. But I would be reluctant to push schools too hard, because we every year we close schools that grew too fast and used to be, maybe they were never as good as achievement prep, but they were pretty good, and then they grew, and then they got terrible, and they got into a death spiral, and they never got out of it. So I would be cautious about pushing leaders beyond their comfort zone. And it's not only, you know, single schools who are thinking about doubling. I mean, I saw the early business plan of Aspire. I saw the early business plan of Green Dot. I was involved with a charter school that had an early business plan, and they were all hockey stick business plans. Oh, we're going to grow a school, and then we're going to add 8. And without fail, every one of them hit reality when they hit the inflection point of the hockey stick and had to readjust their plans, including Rocketship. And so I think one of the broader questions is there something structural about schools that makes them different than Taco Bell's, that says it's just hard to grow faster than a certain pace because the culture and the complexities are so difficult.
Let me ask Richard to talk a little bit about 2 chapters I want to point to, and then we'll circle back to some of these issues and I think raise them in a different way. There are 2 chapters in your book. One is entitled Rumor Just In, Rocketship Falls Through the Ice. And a couple chapters, or 1 or 2 chapters later, Build, Measure, Learn, Rinse, Repeat. Talk a little bit about those chapters, and then we'll get some comments from people on the issues I think those chapters raise, which are not unrelated to what we've just been talking about, but maybe give a little different angle on the... Can you remember those 2 chapters? Okay.
Well, Rocketship Falls Through the Ice, that was actually a phone conversation that I had with Preston. Because I had been interviewing teachers, and the teachers had heard that, you know, the scores had dropped. And so I called Preston and I go, what's going on? And he confirmed it. He knew informally. He said, yeah, pretty much every school went down. And, you know, I'll let Preston speak for himself about why that happened, but essentially it goes back to a decision where it looked like California was going to be cutting funds even further, and they also were looking at sort of reaching a plateau with some schools where they weren't getting the bump up that they thought they needed to take it to the next tier. And after a lot of wrestling around with what to do about this, they decided that they could both save money and boost academics by going through what they call the model change. And that's pushing on personalized learning, but in many cases, at least in each school, a couple of grades, it meant knocking down walls and having 100+ students in one room so that you could have, let's say, a large group instruction going on with as many as 40, 50 kids, and then you would have personalized learning going on a rotating basis. And they actually pulled it off. I mean, based on the test scores in those classes, but based on what the teachers told me, to pull that off in those 2 grades, they had to pull back the resources to all the other teachers. So you didn't have that kind of mentoring, counseling, you know, et cetera. And so they suffered test scores drops in every one. And of course, all the Rocketship detractors, like, this was like their day, you know, just like, oh my God, they've gone nuts on this. And, you know, and it's all in the book about the test score drops, but you have to keep this into perspective. I mean, let's take the school there in San Jose with the biggest drop. Mathews was their first school, and it went from 925 down to like 870. I mean, it was a big drop. Okay, so what does that mean? That means if you go to greatschools.com, which gives you kind of a nice, easy number to put on schools based on test scores, it means that Mathews went from I think it was a 9 down to a 7. It's out of 10. So it dropped from a 9 to a 7. Well, and I looked this up before I came over here. 7/10 of a mile away from Mathews is a school called Gardner Elementary, run by Santa Clara. It's run by San Jose Unified. That roughly, I haven't seen the demographics, but I think on the surface it would pretty much look like your demographics. It's a school that has been showered with a lot of money, a brand new building, and constant new staff, and lots of attention. It's rated a 1, and it's been 1 for a long time. So I find it, something of an irony that the big news is Rocketship goes from 9 to 7, and it's not news at all that Gardner's allowed to bump along from year to year. With ones. So I know that was a long answer, so maybe we'll come back to the other one.
No, that's fine. Let me ask you before we go to you. So what sort of falling through the ice have you experienced as you've thought about the work that you've done in creating the model that you have at Achievement Prep? I mean, what sort of roadblocks have you run into, and what has that required that you do when it comes to rethinking the model or the approach that you've taken?
So, I mean, I would say first, I think that the story of Rocketship is very interesting because that is kind of the burden of being quote unquote high performing is where you don't get the grace, right? So you don't get an opportunity to figure it out. You don't get grace. And so I do think it's very much so ironic, 9 to 7, but you sit next every day to 1s and sometimes 0s. But so you don't get that grace. And I do think there's a big burden that comes with that when you think about growth, because people want you grow, but they don't want to give you any room for mistakes or change or things that come with growth. So that is a concern. I don't quite know our roadblocks yet because this is our first year of growth. So maybe if we do the panel next year this time, I can tell you. I would say that what we've experienced in terms, so I don't know if I've gone from I'm not leaving tier 1, but I don't know if we, where we go down. But I would say that the biggest thing that we've experienced was the leadership change in the growth that we did. We took some teachers who were great teacher or teacher leaders and then put them as the ones who were the instructional leaders, and that kind of growth of what that means and what happens as a result of that was tough. We brought in new leadership to the school, and that was to our flagship school, and that was tough. I think in terms of adjustments, one of the things that we have done, and we've said to funders who wanted us to grow, then you need to help us fund our leader training program, so our principal and residence program, and helping us to do that so that we can build our leaders internally, that they truly understand what it means to be Achievement Prep school, Achievement Prep leader, and then they can go and lead with that versus being expected to do that right off the bat. So I don't know the impacts of the lessons that we'll learn, once our scores and things come out, because this was our first year, particularly doing the restart, which to Preston, he kind of laughed. We opened up a school, 4 grades, K 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 to 4 grades with 250 scholars, and thought we were going to go crazy. So, but that's like a not even a half of what he does on a regular basis. So we'll see what that means in a few months, actually. Okay,
let's get your reflection on the chapter heading here and tell a little bit about the story and so on.
Yeah, so I wouldn't frame it around growth that year. I think my biggest lesson, so I've really kind of reflected and think of the world kind of in a triangle of growth, quality, so you could say scale, quality, and innovation. And in 12-13, we went all out on all three. The model change that we did, and to be really clear about the model change, we actually invested more resources in this. We didn't save any money. That was, there was a long-term thought that maybe that was possible, but definitely not in the short term. And we did it in 7 different spaces across our schools, this open space, did it mid-year, and did it in multiple grade levels. And so going kind of all out in innovation while also going all out in growth and also going all out in quality I mean, something's going to break, and I think we proved that. I don't think you can go out all out on all three edges of that triangle. I think you can push two really hard, and you can tinker with one, but you go too far on each, and something breaks. And to Richard's point, schools are still last year were in the top 5% of low-income schools we were the top. Our district, our network was in the top 5% of the state, so still incredibly great schools. But I think like you said, you don't get much grace, and that's okay. We don't mind the accountability, and I think the thing we changed this year is we focused the innovation. So we still did the open space, but we did it in limited schools and at specific grade levels to really try to support it with adequate resources. And in doing that, we were far more successful. And we've seen the results of our schools, climb back up significantly, and BIT had a really successful year. So I think that's my reflection. That's not a story about growth. That's a story about if you're going to go hardcore in innovation, which frankly our kids deserve. I think we made the right call to push our model, and we've learned a lot from it. We're incorporating things back into our model next year. We're not going to be, I think probably the biggest lesson learned is you don't need to knock down the walls. This open space actually makes it more challenging, but a lot of things we did in that space were the right call for our kids. I think just the amount you do each one, if you go 100% on each, one of them's going to collapse.
I was going to go to you to talk about this because you do it from an authorizer's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, when schools come to us and propose replicating or propose coming to DC, we have to ask ourselves, all right, you're good. Is the next school going to be good? And so we pay a lot of attention to who's going to be leading the school and what's your model. But we also, at least I have sort of an internal score sheet in my head, which is how many new things are you trying to do at once? If you're opening a new school, that's one new thing. But are you also opening new grade levels? Are you turning around a school? Are you coming to a new city? Are you trying a new model? And you start adding up all these things, and if there's too many new things all at once, it's just a higher burden on the school, and it raises the scrutiny that you have as to whether they're really ready to do it with quality.
The other thing, maybe ask you to reflect on if you think it's relevant here. The system here has a three-tiered system. There are tier 1 schools, top like Chantel's, tier 2, tier 3. You're constantly dealing with issues related to performance and making judgments about performance. So talk about those judgments about performance, particularly in light of the innovation and how you balance these things as an authorizer or think about them, and the blips in the radar, how do they factor into your considerations?
Yeah. I mean, our primary objective is to have the charter sector offer extremely high quality across the system, and that it offer real choice. And choice can mean innovation. One of the exciting things about Rocketship was it was a whole new approach that was not really being done here in Washington. DC gives schools a long time. It's a 15-year charter, which gives schools some time to get over their bumps. And we never come into a school after the first year or two and say, oh, not working. We expect that there are going to be bumps in the road. But at each 5-year point, 5, 10, and then 15 years, our standard gets higher. So after 5 years, if the school is manifestly failing, hasn't realized that it's failing, and hasn't done anything about it, we would be likely to close the school. But if the school comes to us and it has not been doing well, but you see a real recognition by the board and steps that they've started to take well before their review, we might give them some extra time, or we might put them on probation and say you need to start improving at a certain rate or the school will close. As you get into your 10th and certainly by your 15th year, if the school hasn't figured it out, then it's a tough decision, but the school needs to close. What we've been trying to do to minimize the burden and the impact on students is figure out ways where a new operator can come in, purchase the assets, if you will, of the school that's closing, and continue serving the same students in the same building. It's our legal way of doing a takeover, but it allows schools, high-quality schools, to expand without disrupting the students. And we have 3 examples of that. Chantel took over a low-performing school in Ward 8, and in the coming year we'll have 2 more schools, one being taken over by the Democracy Prep Network in New York and one being taken over by KIPP.
Let me come back to Richard here, and we'll try to close this part of the program off, then we'll go to questions. Last set of comments here or questions to other people on the panel. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I in my presentation, in the book, I raised the question, how can you, if there are all these schools, there are top 20% of charter schools out there that are getting that year and a half of growth, let's say, out of every year. Why can't you push that more? And it seems like these compacts that I saw in Denver and Spring Branch hold a real possibility for that. And because, let me tell you a little bit more about the Spring Branch model here. So you bring in Yes Prep, and they're building out adding a grade every year, and then they'll start a high school also that will be shared by in a traditional school district. There are all kinds of advantages to Spring Branch to do that. For one thing, that middle school gets to borrow the test scores from Yes Prep, which are higher than the district side, so they look better. Yes Prep avoids spending $11.5 million to build a school. Yes Prep and KIPP get a school superintendent, Duncan Klusman, who's willing to go to Austin and say, we don't have to fight with these charters. These charters are actually helping us. These kids are benefiting here. I mean, there are so many advantages on both sides here, and yet it's not really happening. So I'm interested, in Preston's response to this about dealing with districts' schools. I mean, he's kind of gotten slammed by 30 out of 31 school districts there in Santa Clara County, but you've got one that believes in this, Franklin McKinley, and you just opened a second school there, and it seems to have a lot of potential. So talk about that potential nationally.
Yeah, no, the potential for true collaboration is, I think you laid it out exactly right. There's a ton of potential. Last night, we had a charter approved unanimously by a district in California, in Redwood City. So it's possible. We have another, it's a different county, but it's definitely possible that it could happen again. And I guess what I'd say is what's happened in Franklin McKinley in the district you're mentioning, the ability to share professional development, the ability to share lessons learned, the ability to share resources, bonds, parcel tax, things that the district has access to that we don't. I agree with you. I think that's how you eliminate the achievement gap in our lifetime, right? It's not just Rocketship, it's not just achievement prep, it's how do we really collaborate and create the partnerships. I do think there is going to be some tension. There's some real interest at stake in this work. There's real adult interest, and there's no way around that, and there's real money, and there's real things at stake, and so I think it's going to be tense, but the question is, can all the adults in the room dialogue? Can we figure out a way to kind of compromise and find the truth and find the thing that's right by our students and live within that tension without the vitriol? And I think that's been the challenge in San Jose this past year. There was a ton of vitriol, especially when we kind of fell from that grace. But as we emerge from this school year, a week ago we had a unanimous decision on appeal for a charter. And then just last night. So I think there is a way to really build dialogue and build relationships and move towards trust.
Okay, let's open it up now for the last 20 minutes or so to the audience. And if you have people sending in questions, you can bring those up and I'll ask those too. Questions here? Let's start in the front. There's a mic that they'll bring you. And where else were questions? Let me do 1, 2, 3 to start, okay? And then we'll keep on going. Go ahead.
I have a question about the quantity of what I'll call superstar teachers. If Teach for America only picked 100 a year, they'd have the 100 best. If they decide to go 500 a year, the next 200 and 101 to 500 are lower quality, maybe still excellent. I'm wondering, when you're trying to staff your schools, do you feel that we can get 10 times as many superstar teachers that do a great job? Or are we building a system that'll do that? Or we have to wait a generation for that, or is that the bottleneck?
You want to take it, Chantel? You can. All right. I think talent is definitely a challenge, but I guess the way we think about it at Rocketship, I think two things. One, can we optimize teachers' time and also specialize their time enough that we can rapidly develop them in terms of professional development? When we started, we were unique in that we took brand new core members. Most charters took the alumni, and we said, no, we want them right away. And I think what we've learned is by specializing the content that they teach and allowing them to do it multiple times a day, like they rapidly progress and realize great results. So I think you can have superstar teachers if you're able to really limit what their expertise is and then provide robust professional development around that. And if you want to have elementary teachers do multiple subjects and teach everything, it's really hard to have a superstar teacher. So I think that's how to use technology, how to use tutoring, how do we rethink what a teacher does? If we do that, I think we solve that challenge. I think the other thing is make a bet. You got to make bets, and there's a young woman in our one of the teachers from Alma is here, but we have a young lady, Sharon Kim, who taught for 2 years as a Teach for America teacher, was an assistant principal, opened a school with over 500 kids, and this year that school's breaking a 900 API, which puts it in one of the best schools in the county, right? So there are super talented people, and giving them professional development, believing in them, and giving them the opportunity, and they'll thrive.
Chantel, I mean, you're facing this kind of issue every day, so.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Preston. While I think, TFA is one resource, it would be great to think that every teacher that came out TFA was great and a superstar, but they're not. So I think that schools have to create the ways to develop their own teachers, and going off of Preston's thing. When we opened our flagship, which is expanded 4 through 8, we did it as a departmentalized model, and everybody thought we were crazy because, oh my goodness, you have these children, they should be with the one teacher. And then we opened up our elementary school self-contained with this one teacher knowing everything, and it's not working. So next year we're going departmentalized, because it is about making teachers experts in the content area. That's how you make a superstar teacher. I think what TFA and programs like that offer is some of the kind of mindset that you want in your space, and the ability or desire to do the work. It's not 100%, but I think it's on the schools to create very fast track professional development, very targeted professional development that helps teacher understand how to meet their scholars' needs and move them very quickly.
Okay, I said 2 to somebody. I'm not there. Okay.
Hi. So new buildings are obviously a very strong and a very obvious way to have growth. I've also been hearing a lot of charter schools talking about spreading their influence by being incredibly flexible laboratories for new ideas, new curricula, new management structures, and then very actively trying to spread those to other charters and districts. So I'd love to hear, 1, your thought on that as an avenue to grow your influence, and 2, what kind of challenges you see both politically and structurally for having that incorporated in public school districts.
Yeah, let's start with Richard, and then maybe.
In the book, I profiled Denver, which has sort of the more mature compact agreement. And what Denver did was they brought in 2 locally grown, locally developed charters, DSST and Strive, and then they're not the only ones, they're the main ones. And these charters are as good as anything you'll see nationally. And they brought those and other charters into the schools and really done an amazing job with that. But that's not the only thing they do. And they do share, there is that. But they also have something called Compact Blue, which is where you're a principal, and you think your school could use a little boost, and so you volunteer for Compact Blue, and you come in, and 4 days a year you join the charter schools for professional development. And I was able to observe that. Low performing middle school going to Strive, and I saw these teachers sitting side by side there as they were going over the Strive data. And the jaw of this Henry Middle School teacher just dropped as she was watching what Strive did. And the data that they had that was like 3 days old, and broken down by this and this and this, and it was quite amazing. But I looked at it and I go, this isn't going to go anywhere. I mean, the Henry Middle School people left like rolling their eyes saying, oh my God, we never have, how could we possibly get that culture? How could we possibly get that data that fast? We just don't see this happening. And I thought, my instinct was, it's going nowhere. I just checked back with Denver, and 30 schools have signed up for this. And it's getting a lot more sophisticated, and now they sign up for, we don't want just rub elbows, we want this. You know, we want to know how you're doing special ed. We want this expertise. So there's an amazing amount of interest out there. We, and I'm guilty of this, certainly focusing on New York City and all the fighting because it's fun and there's lots of heat. But I'm amazed when I get out there, the hunger for that kind of collaboration.
Three in the back, and go ahead.
Hello, thank you all for your comments. This is more of a general question about charter schools and why you found them to be successful than the traditional public school model, more successful. Several of my friends who work in the education sphere, when I talked to them about charter schools, they've critiqued it saying, well, you're going to get a better subset of kids that care about, that have parents that care about their education, so you're siphoning off this talent. And I was wondering if you guys could comment from your experience and your research to see, is that the case? What kind of demographics and students are you working with? And why then do you think that the charter school model is so often more successful?
Scott, you want to try that one since you work with the whole series of these schools and think about this issue all the time?
I mean, we hear that a lot. At the local level in DC, all the data would show that it's not the case. The charter schools in DC serve significantly higher percentages of low-income students, significantly higher percentages of students of color, and they serve virtually the same percentage of students with disabilities and English language learners. So we're not seeing any demographic difference. Whether or not there's a psychographic difference, that the kids are more motivated, it's possible, but we have many charter schools who have a deliberate, specific model to focus on students who've been unsuccessful elsewhere, students who have not succeeded, students who've been expelled, students with disabilities. And so there may be some schools that benefit from that psychographic benefit, but I think as a whole in the sector, it's not the case. And then, the research of the highest performing charter schools, for example, there's been extensive research on KIPP that has gone to great lengths to separate out those psychographic benefits, including the Credo study. And all of those studies show that even taking that apart, for example, using students who won the lottery and didn't win the lottery, so they all applied, you see significant differences. I don't know if others want to talk about why charters are so successful, but I would say autonomy and the freedom to innovate and the freedom from the kind of shackling bureaucracy. It's not enough, but I would call it a necessary but not sufficient condition.
If I could just add a little bit, I'm always struck about what I call charter light. And when I see school districts trying to create their own like mini charters, like the pilot schools in Boston, it never works. and to me, you either go all in or you don't get anything out of it. And the all in would be the culture and the urgency.
And I think part of the question is, that because of the unique nature of charters, they attract people into public education who wouldn't necessarily go into public education. And you need to ask, would Chantel or Preston be leading high-quality schools in a traditional public school system?
So, I mean, just to be real, I did lead a traditional district school. I founded a traditional district school. And it was called a small autonomous school. And within 6 months of our opening, they took away the word autonomous out of our title and called us small schools. And that's all she wrote. And within 2 years from that, I've moved on to found Rocketship. So I just think that autonomy, I deeply believe in public schools. I think district schools can do it, charters can do it. But yeah, that autonomy piece is a really big deal. And when the autonomous piece got taken out of our name, things changed significantly in what we could do at our school and changed where my trajectory.
Yeah, Tom in the back.
Thanks, Bruno. I'm Tom Talk with the Carnegie Foundation. I have two questions, one sort of narrow and one a little bit broader. But first, I think it's fair to point out that on the the issue of sort of the performance of charter schools writ large. There are truly some fantastic schools that are innovative and have brought lots of talent into public education. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are lots of very weak charter schools too. And part of your work, Scott, has been to close a bunch of those, to your credit. My questions, one for Preston, is given the machinations and the evolution of your plan, are you still able to save hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in your staffing model through blended learning, as was the suggestion early on? And then more broadly, I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about the new school choice system in DC, which is also emerging in variations in Denver and New Orleans, where charter schools and traditional public schools are being joined in unitary choice systems, which is a dramatic development, one that 20 years ago, at the outset of the charter movement, would have not been thought possible by most people.
Two questions. You answer the first one, and then we'll talk a little bit about the DC situation.
Yeah, definitely. So it's never been about saving money. It's been about reinvesting, right? So the resources and where do they go? And I think that's been the evolution at Rocketship of where do we invest those resources? What's getting us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of student achievement? So is it an additional assistant principal who can coach teachers and give them professional development? Is it higher compensation for teachers? Is it more enrichment for our kids? And I think we've continually kind of evolved in that area. So we have more assistant principals at our campus, so we can have more teacher coaching. We integrated in business operation managers last year, so we could get more of the business work off of the principal and assistant principals, so they could focus on coaching and instruction. So I think that's what we're constantly kind of just focused on, is every dollar going towards our students that's going to optimize their student achievement and their success.
But to be clear, let me push this a little bit. You do find that with this blended learning model, there is, quote, a cost savings that you circle back in, or
we have fewer. We serve the same number of students. So probably the easiest way to think about it is a traditional elementary school. Let's say 25 kids in a class, and there's going to be 4 teachers. And with our rotational model, we have 3 teachers. So that allows us to take that teacher's compensation and reinvest it in other things, like an assistant principal, like books for kids, like one-to-one devices, those sorts of choices.
Okay, then. Talk about, say, like the common enrollment system here in DC. And
sure. So my school, DC, for those of you who don't know, is the common lottery that launched this year, where the mass majority of public charter schools, maybe 85% of them, maybe 90% participated, as well as the selective DC public schools, so the magnet schools, participate in this common lottery. To basically, the goal behind it was really to make navigating this choice structure, which is very relevant and prevalent in DC, make it more accessible to parents, because you have 100 charter schools. All of us could have different deadlines for when an application is due, when you could come in, when you would start, when you wouldn't, and so it's very hard for a parent to navigate. And quite honestly, it was also one of the things that I think also led to the perception of charter schools kind of creaming, because you call up one day, you could enroll, but then if I called up the next day and said my child had an IEP, all of a sudden I couldn't enroll. And so there were questions behind that. And I think what the common lottery did, and the purpose behind it, was to really make this access to choice easier for parents to navigate. I think that it was our first year out, and I was part of the executive committee, as was Scott, and I think the work behind it was absolutely fabulous, and real hard work went into it, and it was a good opportunity for the two sectors to come together and to work together to make this easier for parents. I think some of the downfalls of it is obviously now you have everyone who's in some sort of lottery, and anytime you think about a child's education being dependent on a lottery, there's just that part of you that just flinches just a little bit. But I think what it did is it made it a very transparent process. I think it will help to take away some of the misconception that was asked earlier about who we serve, who we don't, because schools have you take the roster as you get it, versus, that some of the stuff that could happen behind the scenes before. I think there's still some work to do to make it much more efficient. So perfect example, we have 2 apple tree schools right around the corner from our elementary campus, and we did a lot of work with them to tell the parents about it and entering our kindergarten. But then they had to enter the lottery, and so some of them got placed instead of being able to come right around the corner. They got placed, or selected in the lottery, up in Northwest or something of that nature. So I think there's some downfalls of the lottery from that sense, but I think overall the purpose and the ability to make choice accessible to parents is key. And that is one of the things, like, we can have as much choice as possible, but if parents don't know how to access it and access it in an equitable way, it defeats the purpose of choice. That's my personal thought on it.
And Denver, too, has one of these common enrollment systems.
Yes, that was part of the compact.
Yeah, right.
You have that.
Right. Let's do one more question here, and then we'll close and have an opportunity to socialize a bit.
Hi, I have a question about the future of charter schools. I feel like in general and in this panel, a lot of times charter schools are contrasted to traditional district public schools, the bureaucracy, the different culture, the different performance. Is it possible to sustain the charter culture, the lack of bureaucracy, the innovation across all schools? Or do you have to have that comparison there where there's a small group that's able to perform at that level and the rest can't get there? I'm just curious to see where the movement goes.
Richard, why don't you start that, because I know you have an opinion about that.
I do, but I think Scott probably has the most informed opinion about where it's all going. But I would say it's going more and more choice, and it's not just within charters versus district. And I saw the study done on New York City schools, and it was an astonishing number of choice schools there and selective schools. It was like 40%. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So, because that came out of the criticism, the de Blasio versus Eva Moskowitz, and is it fair to compare her schools to district schools? And really, it all comes down to choice. And so here in D.C., you could try to send your kid to, let's say, a basis charter school, but you better know what you're doing. If you send your kid to basis, because that has academic acceleration beyond, it's really quite amazing, but it's a choice. And you can choose that. And you can also choose various magnet schools and et cetera within the public school. So I see it going in that direction, greater and greater choice.
I would agree with Richard. We're seeing that in DC. Charters continue to grow, although our growth has slowed for reasons I'll get into. But even within DC public schools, half the students in DC public schools are not going to their neighborhood schools. They're electing to go to another school that's out of boundary, or they're going to a magnet school. So when you add up all the students choosing charters, plus the students who at DCPS who are going to a non-neighborhood school, something like 75% of the public school students in DC are going to a school of choice. We're seeing something interesting in DC, which is what happens when the competition from charter schools meets a competent school district. So you had Michelle Rhee and now you have Kaya Henderson, who've been two very strong superintendents who've responded to the competition. DC Public Schools was the fastest improving urban school district in the country, according to the NAEP. And the exciting thing for DC is that the residents are starting to take notice. So charter schools have always been adding enrollment, but DCPS is now adding enrollment as well. And so public school enrollment in the district has been falling since the mid-60s. And for the first time in 50 years, it's now turned around and we're adding 2,000 to 3,000 new students a year across the city. So, and we've got a long way to go. We're at 85,000, and in the mid-60s, DC enrolled over 140,000 students. So there is an opportunity for both sectors to thrive and grow on this virtuous cycle of quality.
Let's close. I'm going to go back to another chapter, the one that we didn't talk about before. I started by saying I think the two issues I talked about were a way of encapsulating the beginning and the end of the book. This is a chapter in the middle of the book that I think talks a lot about what we've talked about. It's called Build, Measure, Learn, Rinse, Repeat. It's this virtuous cycle almost that Scott was talking about. Do you remember the chapter you want?
Really, no. But what's interesting about this and the observations about what happens with Rocketship and what happens when you've got a leader like John Danner who's coming in as a startup guy, and it's an incredible story about what works and what doesn't work. And it's kind of he pioneered a path for others who are coming into this, and you can't always take what works in a startup and apply it to school. Some things you can. You're able to build schools at half cost. You're able to come up with new talent development. But the funding, I mean, he would talk about the foundation expectations and how the math doesn't work. Because the more schools you open, the less foundations want to fund you. Because wait a second, wait, I give you this amount, and then you keep multiplying and give me more. And how the stipulations that the foundations would give you don't match as well. And in that the foundation, if they give you money, well, they want to see the school well run, and if a school is well run, then the teachers aren't turning over, right? And of course, in high performing charts, teachers do that at 3-something years, and so it is kind of funny. It's a complete mismatch. So it's all part of the story.
Okay, let's conclude on that. Thank the panelists and thank Richard in particular. Thanks.
You have a great summer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't buy one yet. Okay. Oh, okay.
Yes, very good.